What were the key challenges and breakthroughs that shaped the BC and Ontario wine industries in the 1980s and 90s? What makes or breaks a new wine vineyard project, and why is finding the right vineyard often the most time-consuming step? What made Peter Gamble and Ann Sperling believe that Niagara-on-the-Lake could produce exceptional Chardonnay? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Ann Sperling and Peter Gamble, considered the rock star winemakers of Canada. By the end of the conversation, you'll also discover Ann's best memory from growing up on a family farm, when Ann and Peter knew they wanted to work in the wine industry, and how they met, the first bottle of wine that Ann and Peter shared, how Ann and Peter navigate their interwoven personal and professional lives, how they negotiate professional disagreements, and, more importantly, who chooses the wine for dinner, how Peter envisioned the future of Ontario wines in the early days, the reasons why certain vintages almost don't make it into a bottle, what makes Ann and Peter different from the stereotypical flying winemakers, the signs that Niagara-on-the-Lake could produce exceptional Chardonnay, how working on small, focused vineyards has impacted Ann and Peter's winemaking choices, and why you must suffer to make top-notch wines. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 342. So we're continuing in the lead up to Canada Day, and I wanted to share another segment with you that we did on CTV's The Social. We highlighted some family-owned vineyards from across the country, but first I gave some context. There are 4 major regions in Canada that produce wines made from grapes: British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Ontario makes about 63% of the wine, BC 33%, and 2% for each of Quebec and Nova Scotia, with more than 700 wineries from coast to coast and 1,800 grape growers. Every bottle of 100% Canadian wine made from all Canadian grapes contributes $90 to the national economy versus just $16 for an imported bottle. Pride of place grounds them all. Often the land on which their vineyards are planted is owned by the family, and in some cases for several generations. And I should also add that they acknowledge that they farm on the traditional territories of our Indigenous nations. Being deeply connected to the soil that makes your wine, especially when your name is on the bottle, is a very different mindset from wines conceived in a focus group and made by blending grapes that may be hundreds or thousands of kilometers or miles apart without that connection. Family-owned wineries are often driven more by legacy than by the bottom line. Of course, they need to be profitable to stay in business, but they also want to create something that they can hand down to future generations. These wineries will ship these wines and others they produce across the country right to your doorstep. So there's never been a better time or an easier way to support our homegrown farmers from coast to coast on July 1st and throughout the summer. So we're starting on the East Coast with Lightfoot and Wolfville, a winery owned by the Lightfoot family who have been farming in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley for 8 generations. They originally came from northern England, where their forebears worked as messengers, thus the name Lightfoot. The winery is nestled in Wolfville in the heart of the Annapolis Valley, and the second part of their name. The Annapolis Valley is a long, narrow valley between 2 mountain ranges along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. The world's highest tides create an ideal growing environment for these cool climate wines. This family practices regenerative agriculture to protect their soils for future generations and has earned several organic and biodynamic certifications. We kick off our wine tasting with their bubbly. The Blanc de Blanc Extra Brut Sparkling is made using the traditional champagne method and from 100% Chardonnay grapes. It offers toasty aromas with fresh peach and apple notes. This would be perfect with a fresh Nova Scotia lobster roll. Next, we're heading to Quebec, to Coteau Rougemont Winery. The Robert family has been rooted in Rougemont in Quebec's eastern townships for decades. In 2007, Claude Robert and his adult children, Michel, Julie, and Isabelle, bought a large orchard and planted vines there. They also make cider. They were fulfilling the dream of Claude's father, Rosario, who would drive his apple truck to the top of the hill to admire the view. He dreamed one day of owning this orchard and what is now also a vineyard. The family also likes to say that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We're tasting their Chardonnay, which is planted on the family's south-facing slopes that help ripen the grapes to luscious richness. The aromas of freshly baked bread, green apples, and toasted almond fill the glass. During the early days before they could afford to hire help, each family member took turns monitoring the fermentation day and night. They continue that attention to detail. Now we're headed to Ontario. In 1927, 24-year-old Andrew Peller arrived in Canada from Hungary with just $5 and a dream to make European-style wines in Canada. 24 years later, after working in the wine industry and saving his money, he planted his first vineyard in BC in 1951 at just 58 years old, just when many people are relishing their retirement plans. With the success of the vineyard, that pioneering spirit drove him to plant more vines both in BC and in Ontario. In 1966, his son Joe, then chief of medicine for the Hamilton Civic Hospitals, left his career to join his father in the family business. In 1989, John became the third generation to run the successful family-owned group of wineries that includes Peller Estates, Wayne Gretzky Estates, Trius, and 30 Bench, among others, in a style that is still inspired by that dream. We have the Peller family Private Reserve Rosé, with fresh aromas of field strawberries and fresh crisp acidity. Our second stop in Ontario is called Drea's Wine Company. Andrea Kaiser, the daughter of Carl Kaiser, winemaker and co-founder of Inniskillen Wines, was the pioneer of modern Canadian winemaking. Andrea's father inspired her to create Drea's Wine Company, which produces small batch wines from Niagara. Her first wine, Drea's Sauvignon Blanc, was released in 2019 as a tribute to her dad, along with her family, who affectionately call her Drea. Each vintage, Andrea's father would make her and her mother a special batch of Sauvignon Blanc in his home cellar. The aromas and flavors are bright and fresh with classic gooseberry notes. The 2017 Sauvignon Blanc received a commendation at the prestigious International Wine Challenge in London, England. Now we'll head out to British Columbia. The View Winery is on a parcel of land in Kelowna that has been in the Turton Ward family for 5 generations. Historically, fresh market apples were grown on the property. In the mid-1990s, they transitioned to vineyards and cider apples. The beloved old packing house, built by great-granddad Ward in 1922, was transformed into a winery and cidery. Jennifer Turton Molgott has been president of the View Winery since 2006. Christy French is the winemaker. We're tasting Silver Lining White, an artful blend of cool climate grapes. The back label features uplifting quotes such as, "A diamond is a piece of coal that handled stress incredibly well." It offers vibrant aromas of lime and lemon zest. Our final winery is Hester Creek. The original vineyard on the Okanagan's Golden Mile was planted in 1968 by Joe Busnardo, a BC wine pioneer. The winery is named after the creek that borders the south side of the land. Kurt Garland bought the vineyard in May 2004. He was born and raised in Prince George and has continuously improved the site over the past 17 years with new plantings and a state-of-the-art winery. We're ending our tasting with a red wine called The Judge. It was named more than a decade ago when the winemaker judged the best barrels for a premium Bordeaux-style wine that's won international awards. It's a robust red blend of hand-picked Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon, and it offers heady aromas of dark fruit, mocha, smoke, and toasty oak. And where can we find you and these wines online? Well, on Instagram, I'm at Natalie McLean Wine. Online, nataliemclean.com. Before we dive into today's episode, I'm pleased to announce that Sashi Prakash, a sommelier in Scotland, has won a copy of the award-winning book, Vines in a Cold Climate, about English wines, by Henry Jeffries. So now I have just one copy left to give away. I also have 3 copies of the hilarious book, I bought it, so I'll drink it, and 2 copies of the memoir, Grape Expectations, A Family's Vineyard Adventure in France. If you'd like to win a copy, please email me and let me know you'd like to win. It doesn't matter where you live. I'll choose 6 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Get one of these books for your summer reading or to give as a gift. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/342. The paperback usually arrives within a day or 2 of ordering. The ebook and audiobook are instantly available. Okay, on with the show. Although they're often referred to as the power couple of the Canadian wine industry, I think that's a gross understatement. No 2 people, in my opinion, individually or together, have made a greater contribution to the Canadian wine industry, from the quality of production of our wines here in Canada to getting them worldwide acclaim, than have Peter Gamble and Ann Sperling, who are partners in life and professionally. Ann grew up helping on her family's Okanagan Valley vineyard, Sperling Vineyards, eventually establishing a winery with 2 generations of family members. She has also been the head winemaker at the top-notch Canadian wineries Cellar Creek and Clos du Soleil, and the Niagara wineries Malivore and Southbrook. They're all amazing. Not only is she a pioneer in Canadian organic and biodynamic viticulture, but she has also created the world's first appellation for orange wines before they became trendy. Peter is the founding director of the Vintners Quality Alliance, VQA, something you might see on Canadian wine bottles. Ontario's and Canada's appellation system, or at least we'll get into it, Peter, before I try to qualify what all this is. Ontario's appellation system to guarantee the authenticity and to raise the quality of the country's wines. He has also worked with Canada's most passionate winery owners to establish their winery projects and fulfill their vineyard and winery dreams. And he continues to work with passionate winemakers across the country, including Stratus, Ravine, Benjamin Bridge, and Lightfoot and Wolfville. Now, when Ann and Peter bought Versado, an Argentine vineyard with top-flight ancient Malbec vines in Mendoza, they broadened their scope internationally. But Niagara remains their home base with their current projects on 7 Lely, Stonebridge Vineyards, and Dobbin Estates. And just to clarify, the ones I mentioned previously were previous projects. All right, they join us now from their home in Niagara. And Peter, I'm so glad you're here with us. So let's dive right in because we have got so much to talk about and lots to taste. So Ann, your great-grandparents planted grapes in BC in the 1880s, and growing up, I remember we did a previous interview where you told me you had almost every miniature version of a farm tool, child's version, like a child-size hoe and that sort of thing. What was your most memorable memory of growing up on the farm, and sort of what got you into knowing that you wanted to make wine?
Well, thinking about that, there's a couple of things that stick with me. And one of them is that I remember very young being in the vineyard, in the summertime, walking in bare feet and noticing the texture of the different soils in the vineyard. And that really stuck with me, and, noticed other things around it, but it was more of like the differences that the soils presented and textures and all of that. And then, but really, I think the thing that helped me make a decision, professionally about winemaking was after we planted Riesling, which was in 1978, that winemakers came to visit. They'd come to meet with my dad and to go in the vines and talk about, winemaking, talk about grape growing, how it related to winemaking. And before that, really as a grower and growing hybrids and, other non-vinifera varieties, they were pretty much, you were on your own. Suddenly it was like, there's something really special about these grapes. And that, wow, I could be translating what happens in the vineyard into wine. And I thought that was a pretty exciting opportunity. And of course, the industry was opening up at that time as well.
How old were you when you
Probably
decided?
about 15.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. I love that image of running through the
Yeah.
grasses and the soils.
Yeah, I was probably about 5 when that happened. But,
Okay.
10 years later, thinking that winemaking was sort of cool.
Yeah. And I can imagine that takes you toward organic and biodynamic viticulture, which you'll get into in that, you're deeply affected by, you're truly exposed to your own soils and whatever's planted in the vineyard rows. But I guess you don't do barefoot these days, though, right?
Not that often, but I actually have to admit that I love walking around, whether it's the house or the yard or wherever I get the chance. I prefer to be barefoot than with socks and shoes on.
Keeping it natural. That's great. And Peter, when did you decide to get in the wine industry? Was it when you were growing up like Anne, or was it later in your career? You started at Hillebrand, which I think later became Trius in 1983. Maybe was there a memorable moment that sticks out for you in terms of drawing you into wine?
Yeah, I think the initial thing that really attracted me to the industry, and it's broader than that, it's maybe wine and spirits too, and it's an aromatic thing. I grew up next to a pear orchard. So that aromatic of Bartlett pears, and there's a certain time of year when it's just a really, really, enveloping kind of aromatic, and I always totally loved it. And I ran into, early in university, I think the first time, a Poire William out of Switzerland that just nailed that aromatic. And I thought, how do you get that into a bottle? That smell that I was, so associated with in my youth.
Is that a fortified wine made from pears, just to clarify?
It's a full-out eau de vie, so it's 40% alcohol, and you had to sort of discount the alcoholic aromatic because, of course, it was there. But underneath was this purity of pear and that incredible aroma. So that really began it, I think, a bit more an appreciation of the nose specifically, and then very quickly got into wine and got reading it in university. And by second year in university, I think I'd read pretty much everything extant on wine at the time. It really went into it deeply, decided I'd rather do that than law, and then spent the next couple of years figuring out how to make it into a business. So that was really my start. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. I love that. Again, you came to it through your senses, like Anne.
Yeah, I did. I had the fortune in university, too, of there were only 2 product consultants at the LCBO, believe it or not, at that time. Now I think there's something like 150. One of them happened to be in Peterborough, where I was at school at Trent. So early in that process, and I think probably still in my freshman year, I ran into him. We'd talk about wine. We seemed like the only 2 people in the world with an interest in wine at the time. And anyhow, he pointed out to me that every second week he had to go to the LCBO with the other consultant in downtown Toronto and do the tastings. So for the next 4 years, I made sure that I had no classes on Tuesday mornings and went and did the tastings all the time at the LCBO. So we tasted, Domaine Romanée Conti verticals and a lot of awful stuff too, but a lot of really great wine. So it was a good education.
Yeah, I guess, and classes on Tuesday afternoon must have been a little tough. But yeah, no, that's great. Oh my goodness. So how did you guys meet? Where, when? Paint us a picture of where you were.
Well, we actually met in person in Bordeaux at the biggest wine show in the world at the time, the Vin Expo. We were there for the Canadian contingent. I was still in British Columbia at the time. So we had a Wines of Canada booth, and that was kind of like the first time we actually met. So it's not like we didn't know about each other because of the industry, but that's when we met in person.
That reminds me of my parents. They're both Cape Bretoners, but they had to go to Toronto to actually meet, and then they moved back. But so you're both representing your regions in Bordeaux. What was the first bottle of wine you shared?
Ooh, 82 Talbot, actually.
Ooh,
Yeah.
nice. Bordeaux.
So,
Top-notch
with
Bordeaux.
a little bit of age at the time. That was at a group dinner with a larger group of Canadians outside in Vieux-Bordeaux in the old town. So that was a shared bottle amongst the group of us, but that was certainly the first one we had together.
That sounds memorable. As a married couple, how do you navigate weaving your personal and professional lives? I mean, you're both passionate about wine, so you have lots to talk about, but I mean, what are the challenges or upsides, pros, cons?
Well, I think, it's evolved over time, of course, but when we first got together and had children and, had a lot of balls in the air, we could actually kind of coordinate our schedules. And, when I had to work overtime during harvest, Peter could adjust his schedule to be home and things like that. And I would say we had a really good understanding of, the other person's world because we have or had lived it at various times, and so the commitments that we were making, we could do them kind of together because we could work as a team. We've pretty much carried that on where we have on projects and things like that, there's like a lead person and the other one can support depending on whether it's a skill set or just backup or things like that. So it's actually worked pretty well. And we're not really competing, right? Because, if Peter's Wines wins an award or gets some recognition, it's like, yeah, this is great. It's good for us. It's good for the industry. And so, we just kind of celebrate each other's achievements rather than feeling somehow, slighted by the success of the other one.
Yeah, it's obviously worked out because you're still together. To generalize at a very high level, maybe inaccurately, Anne, are you more in the vineyard and Peter's in the winery?
Yes and no. Peter's very much concept and research person, when he talked about his, getting into wine or when there's a subject that he's interested in, he spends a ton of time on it. I can make my decisions more quickly, I'll say, but certainly appreciate the depth of information that Peter finds for us. But often it's that division, but Peter's also more of the concept person. And, when it comes to winery projects, how the whole project is going to roll out certainly falls into his lap. And I'll say mine on the execution side is a lot of what I do.
Now, Peter, you're trained as a lawyer, at least at the beginning, so lawyers are professional arguers. How do you negotiate disagreements, professional disagreements? We won't get into the other stuff in your professional lives together.
I think a lot of times the decisions are made based on passion. So I'll get interested in a project because it's an opportunity to do such and such. Nova Scotia is a really great example. And so when I began in Nova Scotia, and pretty much at that time would have been spending a lot of her time at Southbrook and busy within the context of her current jobs at that time, and even Malabar prior to that in the very early days of Nova Scotia. And so it was one where, I had a winery owner approach me, about to be winery owner approach me and say, can we do something fabulous here? Like, I really want to do something great. I'm a Maritimer. I'm a proud Maritimer. I really, really want to make, great wine in the Maritime. And I want it to be something that's absolutely world-class. Can we do it? I love that kind of approach, so I spent 2 to 3 months. I'd spent a bit of time out there already within the context of the VQA operations, trying to talk them into coming into VQA in early days and things like that. So I knew a lot of the players, was familiar with the wine, but hadn't really given a lot of thought to, what could you do here that could be great, given the context of the soils and the climate and terroirs and exposures, et cetera. And so I had a chance to look at that in a great amount of detail and essentially came back and said, as an example of that kind of thing, that, there are probably 500 to 1,000 great wines in the world. And here, to make great wines, really, there's probably a run at 3. And, one sort of a high acid fresh rosé approach. One is a, bright, high acid white approach for longevity. And another one is classic sparkling. And classic sparkling, I think, is the real potential strength. We'd have to keep Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier alive, but a really good opportunity. So again, that conceptual kind of look at it. And Jerry McConnell those aren't necessarily my favorite wines, but if that's what we can do best, let's take a run at it. And if in 3 years you decide that we can't make great wines, then we'll just abort because I don't want to make anything normal.
And this was at Benjamin Bridge?
Yeah, that's at Benjamin Bridge, exactly. That kind of thing, that conceptual kind of start. What do we do? What do we plant? How do we keep it alive? What do we do in a business plan that can allow us to put sparkling wine down for 10 years and make great sparkling wine, but still have some money in the interim, which is where Nova 7 came from, and a plan to do a wine stylistically that I thought, suited the region. And so, that's a good indication of the kind of things, we like to do together.
Right. Lead with your passion. So then on a very practical level, who chooses the wine for dinner?
I do that. So we have a big cellar. So we have the advantage of sort of the food is chosen first and sort of decides what she wants to do. That's very much her thing. She's, she'll be really feeling like something that night. And so I'll then match from the cellar. But I know her palate. I know my palate. So often the selections are, the things that she would likely have chosen in any case, maybe. Often.
Are you quite in total agreement, Ann? Or?
Oh, yeah. And I use cooking as my transition from the day to the evening. And so I love to be just immersed in preparing food and working with the flavors and aromas and everything that's happening in the kitchen. And that's really my winding down point. So I'm happy that he wants to choose the wine.
Do your tastes differ in any aspect when it comes to wine? Like, I know you must converge because the styles of wines you produce, there is a signature there. But Anne, are you more, I don't know, Pinot Noir, or Peter, are you more Riesling? Or
not so much varietal, but certainly we come at it from a different direction. I feel like my tasting is more like a sensory reaction and then kind of putting it together. Whereas I think Peter comes it from a more cerebral side right out of the gates. But when it comes to like wines that we enjoy over dinner, like because we have the depth of the cellar, we also have aged wines. And so Peter's probably enjoying them with a bit more age than me, but maybe like a 5 years difference on, something say between 20 to 25 years, somewhere in that range.
Okay. Seems you can get along on that front too. So that's good. So reflecting back on the BC and Ontario wine industry in the 1980s and 90s, and what were the major challenges, opportunities that you faced?
Well, at the time, the industry was pretty small. So it was in the 80s, I'll say the early 80s in BC, and maybe slightly before that in Ontario, that estate wineries became a thing. So for your listeners, like prior to that, that meant there were a few really large wineries not really making estate or single vineyards or really anything that represented the wine growing regions where they existed. Vineyards were a source of bulk wine for the most part. So estate wineries started to be licensed, and a few pioneers in each province kind of broke that threshold. And then more growers, people who'd been growers for, many years, who were just kind of itching to be able to make their own wines, started to produce wine. So there was that new segment of the industry that was really exciting. And so there was good opportunity there. But in reality, a lot of those projects were family operations. So a husband-wife combination or a son-father combination. And so the winemaking positions were actually really small, or very few, I guess I should say, for, someone from outside the family to be part of a project. And, not to say that as those wineries grew, more opportunities opened up, but I was right at that very beginning stage. So I actually started working for a big winery and then moved into a small winery like Cedar Creek. That took like about 6 years or so of gaining experience and then taking over the reins in, 1990 at Cedar Creek.
And estate wines, is that generally meant that the winery who makes the wine also grows the grapes, like owns the vineyards or has long-term contracts with growers who grow the grapes?
Exactly. And that was the big difference, is that, these growers knew their property, they knew the grapes they were producing, and, they were excited to make their own wines. And of course, let the world know about it too, which was giving a lot of attention to the emerging industry that was being created.
Yeah. And Peter, in the early days as executive director of the VQA, how did you envision the future of Ontario wines? I mean, it's certainly changed so much over time, but what challenges were you seeing? What was the industry like? And what are the big changes you've seen since?
I started, as I mentioned earlier, with wine tasting, and then sort of moved from there directly into winemaking and viticulture, and spent quite a bit of time on that front before doing the VQA thing. So it was really, my time at what's now Trius. Before that was Hillebrand, and actually before that was a different name yet again. And so began there in winemaking and sort of getting my feet on the ground as it related to that and to the viticulture and everything, and really saw a tremendous future. I mean, part of the decision to move into the wine industry was a recognition that it was growing. We'd seen what Mondavi had done in California. There was real excitement, I think, in terms of North America growing in a very small group about the ability to produce fine wines, to do something that, France and Germany and Italy and Spain have been doing for a long time, and to take it up to serious notch. And I was interested in that right out of the gates. Like, how do you make great wine? What differentiates it? How much can we do? How much of it is baby steps? How much is there, for potential for the future? So I think right out of the gates, I was coming from a background of knowing very well a lot of the greatest wines in the world from tasting them a lot. And having read, everything about them and understanding sort of the history of it, I taught in the early years at a couple of universities in terms of wine appreciation and wine. And so was, very into it in a lot of detail, and really thought we had a lot of potential in Niagara, and later, as I came to know it, BC and Nova Scotia as well. And so, looking forward to being part of an industry and part of a small cadre of players at the time that were really interested in moving forward in a quality direction. Always looked at it with a great deal of hope, still do, and think that, tremendous things have been done and yet more can be accomplished. So.
Absolutely. Cool. So is there a behind the scenes story you can share with us, maybe about a wine that almost didn't make it into a bottle but became a favorite, or something unusual for either of you or both of you, unusual thing that happened in the vineyard, like from all your years of making and consulting on wine projects?
I think that happens almost every year, like vintages being as varied as they are, there's always some great variety. Every year you're thinking, oh, this could be tricky. And that's part of the challenge of it, like you'll have years, we'll taste a little bit later a couple of wines from 21, which was a difficult year, in a cooler year, and good for some varieties, not so great for others, and look at some of the things you sort of jump through. I think that happens often with vintages. It also happens often with techniques. If you're doing, for example, reductive style Chardonnays, we've had any number of times where you have people come into the wineries and see reductive style Chardonnay winemaking in the process and smell the early aromatics and think, oh my God, can this ever make it to wine? And so
what does it smell like?
It smells like there's a problem with the sewer system in the wine at its very
Just what
worst.
you want in your Chardonnay.
At its very worst. It's H2S, so think of, eggs, bad eggs, that kind of aromatic is fundamental in the early stages of it. You can't skip that stage, you need to be there. So.
Oh, wow. Like a problematic teenager or something, that difficult stage experience, I guess. Anything comes to mind for you, Anne, like a particular vintage or moment, unusual?
Well, I guess, thinking about the 21 vintage, and when it started to rain in the fall and didn't stop, it was like, like Peter says, our experience gives us a lot of depth, and, we weren't panicking because it's like, oh, but if you, think about it, this is like 2006. We had an early start to the season. We had, pretty warm growing conditions through the entire growing season. And now it's raining and it's the fall. So we really just have to wait it out, see how long we can go, and, maybe make some decisions along the way. In the end, we made some rosé instead of red wine and, things like that, some sparkling instead of table wine Chardonnay. But at least having been through that in '06, we knew that those wines had a certain level of ripeness. They had enough balance and body and structure to make them live, So when I was thinking about '06 Chardonnays, like maybe they're going to live 5 years less than their counterparts. But when you're already looking at 15 years out, it's like, we don't really have anything to worry about here. We can work through this, right? So I think that's, a big thing that sort of stands out.
Great. So when you're looking at a new project, because you've done many new starts and new projects, what are you looking for? I mean, obviously a great vineyard site, maybe if you're working with the person who owns the vineyard, passion, etc. But is there anything unique that you can point to that really makes or breaks it for you?
I think it depends a lot on the project. And so, for example, in Argentina, when we were thinking of doing something there, the project became first and foremost, it had a starting base, which was we want to do something really top end. And it doesn't need to be big and be commercial. It needs to be a little more than a hobby, and it needs to work, but it doesn't need to be a big proposition, and it needs to be totally top end, because there was no point in us doing it at any other level down there. We wanted only to do it, really well. So in that case, the hunt for the vineyard became, a very important one, because of course, if, a bad vineyard only makes bad wine or marginal wine or okay wine, but it never makes great wine. And so the hunt became to find a great vineyard. And I spent probably the better part, with Ann spending part of it, but not quite as much time there during those early days, and looking at vineyards. And we looked at over 230 before we found one. I think everyone there was on the verge of giving up on this thing. Well, they're not really going to buy anything, because we'd get it to a certain stage, then we'd do soil analysis and we weren't quite happy, or we'd talk to people who'd made wine from the vineyard and we wouldn't be happy, or, something would come up and we just wouldn't quite be where we were and wanted to be with the quality of the vineyard.
What were some of the extreme things you did? Where were you? Like, could you walk to all these? Or
Yeah, no, Argentina is really difficult in that regard too. They call it the frontier, and for good reasons. As you get up into higher altitude in Mendoza specifically, you're often on horseback. Not only are you on horseback, but there were some areas for potential vineyard, because we were looking at both at that time, that you couldn't even gain access to except by horse. So you're on horseback automatically. But in some cases, there were gauchos going up the day before to hack away the wild roses, because even horses wouldn't get through to some of the territories. You had to determine where water was and that there was sufficient water to do a vineyard with. So we spent quite a bit of time doing that, which is both fun and takes a lot of time.
That's truly frontier land.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
I think you were mentioning you're so high up, you were looking down on condors, like those birds of prey that circle around.
That's
higher.
Right. Yeah.
That's amazing.
One of the early vineyards we were looking at, and Ann and I joked about it quite a bit, was we'd had early conversations with a lot of the French winemakers that had come in with the Clos de l'Assiette, the sort of the aristocratic French group that came in the southern part of the Uco Valley. And in a lot of those earlier conversations with us as winemakers talking winemaker to winemaker, they were saying, we think we came in a little low. We could have been at a higher elevation. pHs are still a little high. TAs are still a little low. It's not quite what we'd hoped for, in many regards. So when we were looking, we were automatically looking at higher elevations there. We got to joking that we really liked the idea of being able to look down on the French, So.
Well, while you brought that up, Clos de l'Assiette, that's Michel Rolland, the flying winemaker, is part of that?
Yeah, exactly.
How would you say you differ from him or the flying winemakers we've come to know typically from France, and they're going around the world consulting at different projects?
I think we're very different in the regard that we make wine differently and our styles are different than the context. It was very much Parker driven within the context of the Rolland thing. So we saw an awful lot of acreages that were left to hang, endlessly, like at ripeness levels at, 26, 27, 28 bricks that would create wines of super high alcohol that you might then use reverse osmosis in order to get it back down to a normal alcohol level. We just thought it was all quite extreme. And we thought that surmaturity in the vineyard was creating flavors and characteristics that weren't necessarily conducive to what we felt fine Malbec could be at lower alcohol levels, done more elegantly, maybe treated a bit more like Pinot than like the Cab family. So that's a big part of it. I mean, I think our interpretations aesthetically of what Mendoza might do best were different than were being done there at the time. I think now it's much different. And with some subsequent players, things have gone more in that direction, which we're delighted to see. But I think that was one of the major differences.
Yeah. Okay. We should jump in maybe to On 7. We're going to come back to Versado, but get a taste of your extreme lengths that you'll go to evaluate a site. But let's talk about On 7 now. It's situated in the 4 Mile Creek, a sub-appellation of Niagara-on-the-Lake, as you know, flat and fertile area that's warmer on average than the Niagara Escarpment, often called the benches, where Chardonnay typically thrives in cooler, higher elevations. So what made you believe that Niagara-on-the-Lake could produce exceptional Chardonnay?
Ann's been lead on viticulture, but I started that project with Vittorio and Sula, so I'll come in early. I often work on the basis of paradigms where I'll take a look at a wine style throughout the world and say, I think this could be done really well in this area. And that kind of thing is a starting point. You need to have some idea if you want to make, really fine wine, what it is you might be able to accomplish within the parameters that you have, the obvious things, the terroir, the exposures, the soils, the temperatures in general. And so in looking at On 7, I knew an area that was between Stratus, which I'd worked on, between the Lely Vineyard, in terms of general location, general warmth, location in Niagara, and knew roughly how much warmer we were than other projects that I'd worked on. That might include, for example, Cloudsley and properties up on the bench for Chardonnay and Pinot. And we had Vittorio wanting very much to do Pinot Noir and Chardonnay as the classic varieties. I saw that as an opportunity to expand what we were doing with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in Niagara to go a different direction of the bench. And to think of it, the bench as being cooler, north-facing slope, thinner soils, heavy limestone background, and things closer to maybe Chablis in style, for example, or a lighter Côte de Beaune. And I saw an opportunity to take the extra warmth of Niagara-on-the-Lake and the 4 Mile away from the influences of the lake and of the river, and to do something with a little more richness, a little more intensity. So a different direction than I would take, or Ann would take, or a winemaker would take on the bench, and go for something in a different style, but with a very specific target, namely a bigger, broader Montrachet-like, to use, a target that I would never expect to reach, but something like that stylistic.
Another sub-appellation within Burgundy itself. So Chablis being up the north, and then Montrachet being more south, and a richer style of Chardonnay.
Yeah. And Pinot Noir within that context.
And Pinot Noir. Yeah, absolutely. And Anne, what was it about the abandoned farm that drew your attention, or this project in general? Did you have doubts because you're going for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in Niagara-on-the-Lake?
Well, I guess just thinking about my first experiences with Chardonnays in Niagara, there were some that I really didn't like, but then started to dig into some of the single vineyard wines that were being made, and realizing that of all of the sub-appellations, Niagara-on-the-Lake probably has the greatest diversity in terms of soil and sort of vineyard potential. So a lot of grapes, they're grown for different reasons, right? Some of the biggest farms are more about productivity than they are about individuality. So this property kind of fell within a geographic area that we knew that we could get more distinction out of. And then, of course, Vittorio and Sula, they were adamant about working organically. So we know that not only the fact that it was abandoned, that equals, soils not disturbed, more organic matter, more biodiversity in the soil. And so we could, out of the gates, get those organic features and benefits from the soil. But also working organically, you're not pushing the vines in terms of productivity. So you can get some of the effects of old vines, as in, more character, more quality, more balance, more harmony, more concentration. You get that much sooner than in conventionally raised vines.
And was there a moment when you knew now that Vittorio and Sula both wanted to farm organically, they wanted to go for excellence, not pushing productivity? Those are all kind of lines up with your goals. But was there a moment or something that made it decisive that you said, yes, these are the right people we want to work with next?
I think that's part of it. When we assess not only the vineyards and the area at first, but also the proprietors. We want to work with people that are, philosophically similar. You mentioned in line, and that's exactly the case. I mean, so we had people in Vittorio and Sula that we knew were, very philosophically similar. They wanted to do top end and only top end. They knew that cropping levels would have to be very low in order to accomplish that. They were very comfortable, and probably the clincher, going directly to your question, Natalie, is on the issue of planting that vineyard. It took us probably 6 years. I think 14, finally, we went in for the first time, the first planting. I think 19 and 20, we were still planting. Ann and I are draconian as it relates to what we'll take from nurseries, what we'll take in terms of rootstock, what we'll take in terms of, rootstock clone combinations and selections thereof in order to go on a vineyard. And we simply were in a period when it was very, very difficult to get the best vines with the best, clones and rootstocks from the best nurseries. And so it took a long time to plant. That's a costly proposition. If, the average producer, winemaker would just, plant it all first year with those clones that are roughly what you wanted. This was not that kind of effort. So a ton of energy went into that and a lot of, time and money, essentially.
So they were patient people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll bet. So On 7 refers to the fact it's a 7-acre property, although I think there might be some additional acres now. But how does working on such a small, focused vineyard focus your winemaking choices compared to larger operations? So you've talked about you could do organic and biodynamic, but you're not pressed for productivity. But are there some other things that come from that?
I would say that there's less room for error because we're just working with that fruit. And even though we, once the wine is harvested and made, we can still declassify if we feel it's necessary. But there's just less room for that. So we want to hope that the decisions that have been made, in the beginning in terms of those plantings, but also, as harvest comes along, as the season progresses, that, we're doing the right things. And we always carve out the time required to visit the property routinely and be engaged with the viticultural team in order to, have them doing things at the right time. And, it's worked very well. And we've been, always so pleased with, in particular, the Chardonnay from that site.
Yeah. And you've mentioned this several times, wanting to do top-notch wines no matter whatever project. What is it about that? Is it just why? Why not just make a lot of wine and be very rich? And
yeah. Well, there are
why
those who
must
do
you
that
suffer?
well.
Yes.
There are those who do that well, and there are those who would prefer to focus on the quality. I think for us, it's it's an artisan adventure. We like very much that context because we came at it. Me especially with my background. Starting at wine tasting as opposed to starting at wine growing. The target was there before methodology was there. And so, I always knew that, where I wanted to be was producing the finest wines with the finest and most complex flavors. That's what fascinated. It was, how do you make that from grapes was one of my, sort of early things that would always be triggered by great wine. I was like, how do you possibly do that with grapes? It's so complex. It's so layered. There's so many things to it. It's such an amazing product. It's an art to a certain extent. And I think that drove a lot of what we want to do and still drives it. So we select based on that ability. And especially now at this stage in our careers, we've turned down, a number of, products over the last few years, and that might have been related to the proprietors or to the vineyard site or, to any number of things. But, plant asparagus. This is not suited for a great vineyard site. It's not what we do. That's part of it. To make great wine is difficult. And so you want to have all of those building blocks in place. We talk clones, rootstock, site, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's that. And then Ann mentioned declassified. It's always a terrifying word sometimes with owners. When, like, wait a minute, what's declassifying? And it's like, well,
It means you're not going to get as much money.
Yeah. Like some vintages, aren't necessarily perfect for certain varieties. Some barrels go awry, some things go awry. And so you need to count on, within your business plan, a certain amount of wine that's not going to make it into your top flight, product. And so anyhow, those are things at the top end that matter a great deal.
And is that what happened with On 7? Did you make a rosé instead of a Pinot Noir one vintage?
Yeah, that's getting back to the 21 vintage. And 21 would have been let me think about this. Actually, sorry, 20, we harvested a very small amount of Pinot Noir. It wasn't enough to fill an oak barrel, which is 225 liters. So in 2020, we did our skin fermentation and all of that in an oak barrel, but then we had to transfer the wine to something smaller for aging, right? So we were able to release, a handful of bottles to their loyal customers in that allocation. And so there was really high expectations for the 21 vintage because it was a little more abundant. But because of that season and the endless rain that we saw through the fall, we felt that we couldn't top what we had done in 20. So that it would be, a great way to still have Pinot Noir in the lineup, but to make it a rosé.
And the numbers and the flavors were perfect in 21 for rosé. Yeah. So we were in the vineyard sort of tasting the Pinot Noir in late August and thinking, ooh, I don't think it's going to get there as it relates to a really top end Pinot Red, but boy, the flavors are great. The numbers are great. The pHs, the TAs, this could make an absolutely spectacular rosé. So the point then comes to, coming back to Victoria and Sue, who were looking forward to Pinot Red and saying, well, given the vintage, this is what we suggest you do. We can do a good Pinot or we can do a really amazing rosé. And fortunately, and greatly, they chose to go with the rosé.
Oh, they are very flexible. Okay. And you keep saying TA. I know pH is acidity levels, but what's TA?
Yeah, total acidity.
Total acidity. Okay.
Yeah, so
gotcha.
Total acidity. It measures all the acidities together as tartaric and gives you a number and a sense of the brightness and the vivacity of the wine, essentially.
And you talk about squishing berries in your fingers, grapes, and slip skins and staining. What's that all about when you're checking for ripeness in the vineyard?
So we have kind of a ritual or a routine procedure that we do when we're tasting, especially as the grapes are ripening and particularly towards the end of that ripening process. And so we're using our senses, all of them, to help to, determine the optimal time for harvest. So, chemical analysis gives us those basic things like the Brix, which is percent sugar, and, our total acidity in grams per liter, and pH that, gives us some indications of ripeness. But it's really what we're sensing. So the whole routine starts with, first you squish the berry in your mouth, but don't chew it, and you taste the juice. And then you kind of mush it around on your tongue, take the seeds out, but hold them in your hand, taste the pulpy part of the berry, and see how that texture and flavor is. And then chew the skins, like first your initial impressions of how crunchy it is, how much resistance you get. And then you chew and chew and chew and chew and chew. And you get you start to get a flavor from the tannins. So when just almost any variety, when it's underripe, you'll get spinachy flavors when it's green, and those start to disappear as it matures. And then you start to get, deeper flavors from it, and mostly texture when you're assessing the tannins. Then you open your hand and look at those seeds, and you see, are they green? Do they have some green and some brown? Are they wholly brown? And then you can put them between your teeth and kind of test how dense they are. All of those kind of starts to build up your database from each tasting through the vineyard until you sort of hit that moment when you go, yeah, this is the right time.
You really torture your noses and mouths, spinach and sewage.
And we even do it with stems, Natalie. I mean, worse than that is a lot of times, especially
you're chewing
over the
on
last 10
stems?
years.
That's like chewing on bark.
I know, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. So this gives you a physical sense. It's beyond the chemical analysis and the machines and everything else. You're in there again with your senses for that last mile or whatever, trying to analyze that way. That is fascinating. And slip skin, does that mean if the grape berry comes out of its skin easily, is that a sign that it's riper?
Actually, it's more of a tendency of the individual varieties. So kind of the classic slip skins that we grew up with in the very early days were the Labrusca, where you can, actually squish that berry and almost the whole thing pops out and you're just left with the skin in your hand. But most of the vinifera's don't do that. So there's a real distinction there. But Malbec has that tendency. And so where we see it is if you have a late season rain in Malbec. In the case of Malbec, it's almost like a dilution layer next to the skin. So the internal part pops out. And so that's like a physical property that we assess to determine after a rain when we're ready to pick, because then you lose that slip skin tendency and you know that you're back to the concentration level that you had before the rains.
Very interesting. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Ann and Peter. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what were the key challenges and breakthroughs that shaped the BC and Ontario wine industries in the 80s and 90s? As Ann and Peter explained, at the time, the industry was really small. So it was in the early 80s in BC and maybe slightly before that in Ontario that estate wineries really became a thing. Prior to that, there were a lot of really large wineries, not making estate or single vineyards. Vineyards were just a source of bulk wine for the most part. But a few pioneers in each province broke that threshold. And then as more people who had been growers of grapes for many years were itching to make their own wines, that really started to produce quality wine. A lot of these projects were family operations, and as those wineries grew, more opportunities opened up. Number 2, what makes or breaks a new wine project, and why is finding the right vineyard often the most time-consuming step? Well, Ann and Peter observed that it depends a lot on the project. In Argentina, they wanted to do something really top-end, so it did not need to be big and commercial. But they wanted it to be more than a hobby. The hunt for the vineyard became an important one. They looked at over 230 vineyards. Oh my gosh. As they say, I think everyone was on the verge on giving up on us, thinking they're not going to buy anything. Because they get to a certain stage, do a soil analysis, not quite happy, or they talk to the people who were making wine from the vineyards, something would come up, and it wouldn't be just right. But just like Goldilocks, in the end, they found the perfect vineyard. Except they had to look at 230 first. And number 3, what made Peter and Ann believe that Niagara-on-the-Lake could produce exceptional Chardonnay? So the couple really works with a lot of different vineyards throughout the world, looks at different paradigms. So they're looking at the obvious things like terroir, exposure, soil, temperatures. And when they looked at On7 Winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake, they knew that area, there was vineyard area between Stratus and Lely. They'd worked on both of them. And they knew how much warmer that was, that area, than previous. So when they spoke with the landowner, Vittorio, he really wanted to do classic Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And they saw this as an opportunity to really go after that in Niagara-on-the-Lake and to go on a different direction than the Niagara Bench, which is cooler, north-facing slope, thinner soils, heavy limestone, that really made wines closer to Chablis in style, that unoaked Chardonnay from northern France. They saw this as an opportunity to take the extra warmth of Niagara-on-the-Lake and do something with more richness, more intensity, bigger, broader, a more Montrachet-like style. All right, in the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Ann and Peter, links to their website, as well as to the websites of the various wineries mentioned in today's episode so that you can order wine directly from them. Most will ship right to your door in Canada. The video versions as well of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 72, go back and take a listen. I chat with Ann Sperling about orange wines and biodynamic farming. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
I think that's really what I'd like to see happen with orange wines is lots of small batches and lots of engagement at a really foodie level, like right there with your plate of whatever, your local fresh vegetables and locally raised meats and things like that. And to really start thinking about winemakers as farmers and as people that are making their meals more interesting.
Absolutely. And you refer to yourself as a wine grower.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's the engagement with consumer. I think that we have some barriers to that with a big organization like the LCBO distributing our wines and making it more distant from the consumers. And sure, it's more convenient for everyone. But at the same time, I think we want to engage and realize that our wine and our food are coming from our local agriculture.
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Ann and Peter. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about Niagara wines. It's easy to find the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you'd like to win one of 6 books I have ready to give away. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/342. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a gorgeous Niagara Chardonnay that tastes like Montrachet, but at a quarter of the price. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.